welcome to this latest edition of Neighborhood Scope, where we look at India's neighborhood and the issues and problems bedeviling the region. But today we are looking at the new US administration and what that might involve for this region. And we have a very good panel with us. We have my colleague Vivek Mishra from ORF out here. We have Michael Gugelman from the Wilson Center. We have Nilantara Samara Naike, who's also based in the United States right now. She's with the United States Institute of Peace. And we have Prerna Bauntra, who is just about to come, but she is Deputy Director at the Ananta Center in New Delhi. So I'll put a series of questions to all the panelists. And then once we are over with that, we will go in for Q&A. And that's the game plan. So let me just start first with Vivek, who is our in-house expert on all things United States. And the obvious question, Vivek, is we have the Trump administration coming in. There's been a lot said about the administration, about the new president's personality, his transactional approach, as though that's a very bad thing. I would imagine that's pretty normal in international relations. His Make America Great Again philosophy, ideology, whatever you want to call it. We know all of that, right? But the question from the perspective of the Indian subcontinent is, where does this region, or how does this region stack up in Trump 47's order of priorities?
Thank you, sir. It's also Nilanti and Michael. Good to see you. So I think to dive straight into brass tacks, where does this region figure out in Trump's agenda? It's very difficult, obviously, but let me try and make a sense of it. I mean, I would at least put it in the first 5 order of things in terms of how the US looks at the world. And I think those are, one would be what we are seeing currently unraveling in the policies, the executive orders that have been put out by the Trump administration. A series of them have to do with the domestic compulsions, obviously. But I think the global interconnectedness of America has a third order impact for the Indo-Pacific and South Asia. So I think the first would be domestic. The second is international. The third is Indo-Pacific region. You could swap the order in the manner that you like. The fourth is China, and I think fifth is bilateral with India. That's the order that I sort of look today to put it out. Now, in the order of things, I mean, in the domestic order in the United States, if you look at the Trump administration's focus right now, the executive orders that have come out, it is the first concentric circle, which is the immediate neighborhood. So he's looked at Latin America, for example, the pressures in Bolivia, Canada, the tariff question, Mexico, obviously the emergency at the southern border. These are invariable components of that policy. But I think in the broader extension of the second and the third concentric circles is going to focus, and in that first circle, he has also managed, whether or not he has managed, but I think he has claimed to have brought a peace deal of some kind in the Middle East. Now, all of us know that this deal was in the works for quite some time, and that it unravels just before Trump takes office is to many no coincidence. The second is in the second order of things. I mean, he's also looking at the Russia-Ukraine war, and if that conflict were to be resolved in some form, and even if an intermediate or a temporary ceasefire were to be held, then I think he would reorient his focus to the Indo-Pacific, so that he not only sort of squares that circle of his campaign promise of resolving the two conflicts, but I think return to China, which is a great, uh, if you look at the people within the Trump administration, is the greatest focus of, or could be the greatest focus of Trump in many ways. And the Quad meeting on the second day of the inauguration is very suggestive. The order of the meetings also prioritize India's importance in that listing. And I think what has happened in the last few days in terms of the stock fall in the US because of the Chinese DeepSeek app also will play on as a compulsion within the Trump administration to sort of return to the great power competition in China. And the reason why I say the Indo-Pacific will remain important and China at the top of it in terms of a competitive dynamic between the two countries is because various studies have suggested that there is, what was called the decisive decade in the Biden administration in terms of a US-China dynamic has only been half complete, and the other half of that decade is left. So, Trump gets to complete that arc. So I think with that initial set of comments, let me stop and probably I'll come back to more points.
Thanks, Vivek. Michael, if I can just turn to you. So, the question, which is probably going to bother a lot of other parts of the world as well, will be how much of the Trump foreign policy will be driven by the president himself, and how much of it will be influenced by some of his aides, national security. In the national security, I know establishment is a four-letter word these days in the United States, like it is in Pakistan, but just in the larger scheme of things, how much of it is going to be influenced by them, and that becomes important from the perspective of the subcontinent, because some of the most critical appointments that have been made, whether it's the national security advisor, whether it's the secretary of state, even the defense secretary, the director of national intelligence, all of these people, they have had some experience of South Asia. They are familiar with the region. They have their likes and dislikes. They probably have some access to grind. They have seen war, peace, diplomacy in the region. How much of that is likely to influence whatever is the policy framework with which Trump 47 is going to approach this region?
Thanks, Sushant, and thanks to ORF for including me in this discussion. It's a very interesting question. I think it's hard to give an answer now. I think that one way of starting to answer the question is to consider what countries or subregions of South Asia are those where Trump would take a particularly strong interest and would want to have a more hands-on role, so to speak, in terms of driving policy, as opposed to those areas where he would be happy to defer to his cabinet or to others. I think there are two specific examples where your question is particularly salient. One would relate to Afghanistan, because if you look at the people that Trump has picked to join his cabinet, and if you look at Trump himself, I think that there could be some significant differences in views in terms of how to approach Afghanistan, in the sense that Mike Waltz, as I think we all know, who's the national security advisor, he has always been a very harsh critic of the Taliban. He had never wanted U.S. forces to leave Afghanistan. He had thought that they should continue there to fight the Taliban and to fight terrorists. Whereas Trump himself, of course, authorized his administration to negotiate with the Taliban, talks that, of course, led to the Doha Accord that led to U.S. Troops leaving. So how you would, the difference in perspectives you could have from the likes of a Mike Waltz and a Trump on the issue of how to engage with the Taliban, I think could be very interesting, particularly when it comes to the issue of Islamic State Khorasan, which is, I think that Trump likes to say that he likes to brag that he defeated ISIS. So I think that he would certainly also want to be involved in an effort to try to curb the resurgence of this group, and that plays out quite vividly in Afghanistan with ISK. Would he be willing to essentially defer to the Taliban, as the previous administration did, in essentially acknowledging that the Taliban was doing a good job of degrading ISK in Afghanistan? Whereas I think someone like Waltz would be of the view that we can't trust the Taliban with anything, much less going after a terrorist group. So that'll be interesting to play out. And the other example that I would cite here, comes to the issue of China, which is something that's going to, I think, animate so many discussions about U.S. foreign policy on the whole in the second Trump administration. And I would argue that Trump is less of a China hawk than much of his cabinet is, or those that he's picked to join his cabinet. But getting to your question, it's a good one. But the only way that I can answer that question is essentially to say that, well, you have to look at areas where Trump is particularly interested in taking on a very significant hands-on role himself. In other areas, he would just defer to others. And I would argue, quite frankly, when it comes to South Asia, and this sort of gets in a bit to what Vivek had to say before, this is not going to be a top priority region on the whole for the Trump administration, but it will have priority because of the fact that great power competition is such a big thing for U.S. foreign policy, has been for quite some time. That's going to drive the Trump administration's approaches as well. And South Asia as a region is viewed as a part of the Indo-Pacific, and it is viewed as a part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, which of course is the core U.S. strategy in Asia, which Trump himself came out with during his first term. It was retained by Biden, and I imagine that Trump will retain it. Every country in the region except for Afghanistan and Pakistan are viewed as a formal part of the Indo-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific policy. And if you look at U.S. strategy documents focused on the Indo-Pacific strategy in recent years, talks about the countries of the region, except for Afghanistan and Pakistan, being important partners of the United States. And there's a lot of reference there for scaling up support in terms of cooperation in terms of maritime security, counterterrorism, and the like. So South Asia will not be, I don't think it'll be a top priority relationship on the whole, but when it comes to strategic concerns, I think the fact that great power competition has become what it is, and it's going to drive U.S. foreign policy in this administration as it did in the previous one, that it will be viewed with strategic concern by this administration. Back to you.
Nilanthi, if I can now turn to you, when Michael says that South Asia might not be at the top of the priority list, do you think, from your perspective, that's not entirely such a bad thing? In the sense that if it was one of the top priority items on the agenda, then of course there would be probably a lot more trepidation in the region than what there would be otherwise. But even so, if there is the kind of strategic realignment that Michael talks about, uh, how do the smaller countries in the region navigate that path? Would they prefer to stay under the radar screen uh, and wait for these 4 years to pass by, uh, or and I know that's easier said than done, uh, or would they have some other game plan on how to deal with the current situation, especially given the fact that some of these countries, Sri Lanka for one, Bangladesh for another, uh, are in a bit of a financial soup, right? Uh, they are uh, they are struggling to get the economies back on track, uh, and for many of these countries, the US is one of the most important markets. So there is some leverage which is there. Maybe aid, not so much, but certainly there are other pressure points. How do these smaller countries navigate during this period?
Thank you, Sushant. Those are some excellent questions, and my thanks to ORF for the invitation to participate today. I'll share my personal research and views. Uh, yes, I think we have seen, it's only been a week, but we've actually seen quite a lot come out of the White House, the Department of State, and the Department of Defense in the past week in terms of directions and plans about where the administration's going. And yes, I think if you look at Secretary of State's Rubio's priorities and mission document that came out of the State Department for the second Trump administration, for my read, it appears to be a clear strategy that's really based on U.S. national interest, and he specifies a clear three-pronged approach, essentially how the U.S. is going to justify its programs and its spending. And there's three lines, essentially. The first criterion is, does it make America safer, stronger, and then prosperous? So when we think about South Asia, and particularly the smaller countries, to get to your question, those are the three criteria along which programs and spending will be assessed. And then that document really talks about several priorities. And right at the top, no surprise, is securing U.S. borders and stopping mass migration. And I think this really confirms really an increased attention to the Western Hemisphere. And I've argued we've actually seen evidence of this greater emphasis on the Western Hemisphere under the first Trump administration. When you look at its work on Arctic security, the Arctic is a homeland defense issue for the United States, and that administration's attention to the waters of the Atlantic. So I think we're seeing a signal that this attention to the Western Hemisphere is only intensifying under the second Trump administration. And as Michael was referring to, the first Trump administration, if you look at the National Security Strategy document, that really identified and articulated the Indo-Pacific as a strategic region of interest for the United States. It really cemented that shift away from talking about the region as the Asia-Pacific. So I think that was a really important document in terms of sending the signal that subsequently the region in U.S. articulation of its interests and policies is going to be referred to as the Indo-Pacific. And as one example, we saw Pacific Command the following year renamed to Indo-Pacific Command. And also, I think another important development that occurred under the first Trump administration was we saw essentially the name or the articulation of this new era of great power competition. That was also a new concept that was unveiled in the National Security Strategy of 2017. And so I think that attention to competitors like China, that's only also continuing under this administration. So as a result, the Indo-Pacific, it is an important theater of interest. So that seems to be some continuity from what we saw under the first Trump administration, and Secretary of State Rubio's readout of his meeting with India's Minister of External Affairs, Jaishankar. He also repeated that phrase about the free and open Indo-Pacific. So that suggests some continuity there. But I also think that what we saw out of the Secretary of Defense, his message to the force, he also talked about how the president has given us a clear mission, achieving peace through strength. And one of the ways that he mentioned was reestablishing deterrence. And he talked about we'll work with allies and partners to deter aggression in the Indo-Pacific by communist China. And he talked about how the U.S. will stand by our allies. So I think there's some continuities there from the first Trump administration. And to your point about the smaller states, I can definitely see what you mean about staying under the radar. But at the same time, if you look at the example of Maldives, under the first Trump administration, we actually saw that Secretary of State travel to Maldives, which is a rare event for a U.S. Secretary of State. And he announced that the U.S. would open an embassy in Maldives. So that was a pretty big change in US policy under the first Trump administration. And really in the past few years under the Biden administration, we really saw the implementation of that vision. So, smaller states, they can sometimes see an uptick in their engagement, and particularly with the Trump administration. So, it remains a question: is the Trump administration, how are they going to turn toward their Maldives policy, or are we going to see similar shifts and upticks in engagement? So, I'll pause there.
Up on that one, I'll seek your patience on this. Uh, so, is there any concern? Let's take Sri Lanka, for example. You've had a fairly close relationship with China. The Chinese have invested a lot of money in Sri Lanka. Most of those projects haven't really, paid for themselves. In fact, they become a bit of a pain. But nevertheless, I think the dependence of Sri Lanka on China remains. Similarly, you have the United States, which, as you very correctly say, is working on, on this whole Indo-Pacific strategy. Is there a concern in a country like Sri Lanka, for example, that you could start getting crushed between these two competing powers? In the sense that you have the pressure from the Chinese, you have the pressure from the Americans, and then how do you navigate through those pressures?
Well, yes, I think when we're talking about smaller states in general, they engage essentially in asymmetric relationships with large powers. So whether it's a Sri Lanka and its relationship with the United States or with China, there's definitely a power discrepancy, and as a result, smaller states tend to feel pressures when they are engaging with large powers. So that's generally, but at the same time, certainly. I think a country like Sri Lanka, it's going to seek assistance from as many partners as possible. So that of necessity includes China, but that also includes the United States. And I think one of the interesting things that we saw under the first Trump administration is that under the National Security Strategy of 2017, that document talked about the need for the US to modernize its development finance tools. And so we actually saw the stand-up of the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation in the United States. And one of the interesting outcomes of DFC that we saw that actually took place under the Biden administration was this deal with Adani in terms of Colombo Port as a project. So it's interesting. There's certainly been some controversy there, and we don't quite know how, what might turn out of that particular project. But it's a question in my mind, to what extent is the Trump administration going to pursue that project or some form of that project? Because there really is an interest from the first Trump administration with regard to the DFC, since that was really its brainchild, and particularly in a smaller country. So Sri Lanka, even though it certainly faces pressures when navigating large powers and facing this asymmetry of power, at the same time, it can certainly realize gains, and it can really leverage certain strengths, like in its port sector. So it remains to be seen with regard to its port projects and to what extent it can really leverage the DFC.
For coming to your last, but let me ask you a very provocative question. So, again, everybody says Trump is very transactional. Michael, for example, was talking about how he isn't as much of a China hawk as many people make him out to be. And the fact that he's constantly looking for deals, he's talking about a trade deal with the Chinese, otherwise he's going to go crazy putting tariffs on them and stuff like that. But the question is, if supposing the Chinese were to give him what he wants, right? They were to cut out a good deal with him. What is the chances that Trump would say, okay, fine, let me throw everybody else under the bus? All this nonsense of Indo-Pacific strategy, containing China, stuff like that. I don't care. I've got a good deal. The others can go and take a hike. What are the chances of something like that happening?
Firstly, I'm sorry for being late. The traffic I will blame on the deep state or
Just
some
take time.
such. That's perfect, and this is my reward. Provocative questions. Um, let's first talk about the transactionalism and the premise of the question being if he's able to secure a deal with China. What that premise tells us is the fact that the tariffs have always been a threat mechanism to get to a bilateral negotiation table. So if he does get that deal, great for him. I don't see that being mutually exclusive with the deals that he strikes with other countries. Rather, he would consider that to be a constellation of deals that he was able to secure, and his base would be all the happier, and he can then, I don't know, boast about the fact that he was able to bring down trade deficits wherever they existed, and he was able to get everyone underlined and get the business deal done. And all hail the great New York deal maker. He will be fine with that. The larger question, though, is what is his end game with China? That's become confusing for all of us. Now, the TikTok back and forth has told us that let's not just view the back and forth post Biden saying that I'm going to let Trump decide what to do with the deadline for TikTok acquiring an American partner, and let's see what the next administration does. Let's remember that Trump was the first person in his first term to pass an executive order about TikTok's stake in the United States and the data that they were getting being a national security concern. So he's gone back and forth on it himself. The fact that, circling this back to the question you asked, Michael, actually, how do we see the foreign policy priorities of Trump, the White House, and the agencies? Do they clash at all? I think the bigger question is the lack of clarity there. Does that impact what they're able to legislate on? Because there is something to be said about the fact that as assertive as we think Trump can be with the executive orders, a lot of that has to pass through Congress. Now, great, he's got the Republicans in the House and the Senate, but the Senate is only like a 53, including the vice president majority. The opposition can always filibuster it, say we need a 60% approval on any bill that you legislate. There's already discrepancies coming on in terms of the national security concerns that a lot of the senators have. There are concerns about the fact that Senator Rubio's call with Wang Yi, he mentioned that we do not favor supporting Taiwan. I'm paraphrasing here, but the fact that this administration is not as bullish on trying to protect Taiwan as the previous administration was, but the Senate Armed Services Committee leaders are. And they consistently talk about the fact that in the national defense reauthorizations, they will try to fortify Taiwan more. How do you reconcile those things? How does the interagency administration alignment merge with the legislators? There is that element. And there is something to be said about the fact that, well, deals are deals. If tariffs are something that we have to contend with, it's something that every international partner has already thought through in terms of what can we barter on. So if India has already thought about, okay, we'll reduce duties on pork, on Harley Davidsons, which is the bane of our existence with the Americans, it seems, apples randomly, whatever is a non-strategic element that we can give them a win on, so that they will come to the table and start talking to us about the strategic elements. The biggest one of which for us and an immediate priority is the tech relationship. How do we get this Trump administration to own ISET? How do they want to rebrand it to make it their own, as opposed to, we can see based on all the executive orders that Vivek talked about, that this administration is on a bend of negating everything that their predecessors did. Now, in that bend, do we lose out on a few things? Can we make that work in our favor? Can we push at the right time and tell the administration that, hey, we agree with you that most of the things that President Biden did, especially in the last few days of the transition, were not in American interests. Things like putting India in tier 2 of the AI supply chains. Can we become a tier 1 category country? Can we just get rid of the tiers because this is something that just came out? How do we pressurize and get a deal in our favor? Because a deal is how the life is going to go for the next few years.
What are the possibilities that Trump 47 will be willing to trade a deal on tariffs with something on the strategic front? Or is that just our assumption?
It's not going to be a perfect superimposition. It's not going to be a zero-sum game. We should be prepared for some amount of losses there. The the way the math works in this administration is India has a trade surplus with the Americans, they need to reduce it. Even if they reduce it by $1 million, $5 million, as long as the percentage decrease is substantial for them to boast about, they will work towards it. It's about giving them easy wins. Of course, your question is valid. Will they allow the easy wins in non-comparable asset classes or in categories of goods and services? The question is, it has kind of worked before. When Bob Lighthizer was USTR, he did come to the table saying, sure, tariffs are where we have to start and we will have to talk about the reality of some tariffs coming in. You are calling India a tariff king, calling the fact that India has done to America what America is now threatening to do to India. So it's fair game. We have to contend with this reality, sure. But Bob Lighthizer also came very soon to the table saying, let's talk about the places where the real deal is. He was the first person to start talking about a digital future, creating a digital corridor, creating standards together that the rest of the world could apply to. His chief of staff is now USTR. There is continuity in what they did in term one, what Biden continued, because Biden's industrial policy as it relates to his trade policy is actually very similar to Trump's. They are continuing that. It's just about rebranding. So sure, it's not going to be as neatly boxed. We will lose out on some things. It's about having strategic elements that we want to put there and branding them well.
Yeah, I suppose, reducing the trade surplus is not going to be that difficult, because if the Americans are going to be pumping more oil, we can always buy more oil from the Americans, which basically means we'll be buying less oil from somebody else. Just too bad. That's the way the market works. So Vivek, Prerna has laid out some of the stuff which we can expect, but in more specific terms, what are the kind of asks that are going to come out of India? So we know about this tariffs and stuff like that. That's, I think, probably a lot of it has already been gamed. But let's talk about in the strategic domain. What are likely to be the asks that are going to come of us? So for example, we have tried to walk the tightrope. We haven't gone whole hog one way or another in either side. Do you think that could come under strain as we go forward? That, of course, assumes a lot that the Americans are likely to get their act together on China, and Prerna's quite right. There is a kind of confusion as to what exactly do they want out of China. So there is, given all of that, where do you think, what are going to be the big asks of India? How much of it will be acceptable, and where all will India balk? And what does India want in exchange? Because it cannot. If Trump is transactional, so are we. So what do we get in return? If our game plan is only about give us 20,000 more H-1B visas, which is the most stupid thing we are doing, then I think the game's up, right? If we are talking about, allow some, although we are not, to be fair to our people, about illegal immigration, if that's a big agenda item, that's stupid. Because for most of us staying out here, living in India, a guy who spends 30-40 lakhs of rupees and wants to go and live the American dream, that's his problem, not my problem. So, that moralizing thing which we keep doing, world peace and stuff like that, or is it going to be something much more specific? What do we want? Are we clear about it? And please don't tell me I want technology transfer, because that can mean anything.
Yeah. No, it's Trump's world, and you're asking me to be specific. But
My friend, you are living in Trump's world.
Yeah.
You might as well get used to it.
Let me start with the broader geopolitics of it. I think if you look at the last, and much water has flown under the bridge since the last Trump administration, but I think if you look at that term as a template of even 20%, then I think some of one ask could be that India should step up. Now, the counter argument that I have come across in my conversations is that India has already stepped up in the Indo-Pacific. The Western Indian Ocean is a space where we have more footprints than we had earlier. There are more ship crossings, joint refueling, etc., between the US ports and Indian ports than before, because also because of the agreements that we've signed. but also because of the intent of India to step up in that region. And not just because of the US, but because of other connections in the Gulf, for example, in Bahrain, etc., where India is engaged intrinsically in terms of port infrastructure. So the broader consensus is that the Trump administration could ask India to step up in terms of more joint patrolling, joint exercises. It depends on the nature of ask and what India can do. Now, the other thing is that because India has also, if you look at the Indian naval footprint in the Indo-Pacific, a lot has changed in terms of how much we are doing on the eastern side of Strait of Malacca. And I'm sure Nilanthi will attest to this. Now, could the Trump administration use that footprint to ask India to do more on the eastern side of Strait of Malacca? And how much intent does India have, and in terms of what it can do? I think that's the question that will unravel in the next few months, or perhaps years, when Trump administration really refocuses on China in the real sense of a great power competition. On Taiwan, I think I concur with Prerna on broadly what she said. But if we look at now, let me come to the specific issues on what the steps that Trump has taken in terms of executive orders, and some of those could fall by the wayside in terms of congressional approval. But I think most of them will pass if you look at Trump's ability to take a congressman aside and talk to them personally, arm twist them if need be. Now, if you look at the tariffs, I think much ground has already been laid. But I think in terms of I see tariff as for the Trump administration to be and this also came up in some of my conversations, that the Trump administration could actually ask Indian investors, big investors, or ask India to ask their big investors to invest in, let's say, Ohio, Midwest, or somewhere in a fab plant or some other businesses. So that's one option on the table. And you have a pretty high intent in terms of Indian investors looking at the US. As we saw, the Ambanis, Adanis are well engaged in the US network in terms of investment. Now, in terms of there are also there are asks, and then there are compulsions. What are the compulsions that India will have to face in terms of some of the policies? I think in terms of the EPA policy, the energy policy, etc., the executive order, if you look at, he's trying to reverse the Biden policies on EVs. Now, as a citizen of India or living in the global south, I mean, what will be the third order impact of that in terms of your SDG goals, in terms of your commitment to non-zero by 2070? That's a question to my mind. The Paris Accord and the WHO, out of which Trump has pulled out America. Now, particularly, again, the Paris Accord is important because from India's perspective, because we are looking at that from a certain investment angle for the global south, etc. Foreign policy and military strength, I think if Trump really were to bring a new component, I mean, there is some talk that the first fleet will be revived. I don't think it will be in the Western Pacific. But I think certainly the military intent of America is going to re-energize in the Pacific. And I think the asks from India in terms of naval, joint working, patrolling, etc., will sort of increase. But I think in the broader sense of the term, South Asia is also fortunate to be not in the crosshairs of Trump directly. If you look at the immediate neighborhood, Trump is high on the manifest destiny part of America's expansion. He's talked about Greenland, he's talked about Panama Canal, he's talked about Canada. So from that angle, I think South Asia's distance also sort of plays that buffer, which is good. So I think in the end, no word is probably a good word till now.
Michael, I'm very tempted to ask you a question that you've been asked by all Pakistani channels on Imran Khan and whether Trump is going to intercede on his behalf. but I'll spare you that agony. You've been doing it quite a lot on the Pakistani channels, but look, on the China front, right? Given the fact that there is a very close relationship between China and Pakistan, and let us assume, again, everybody, we are all feeling around in the dark because it's all very inchoate right now. But let us assume that apart from the economic contestation with China, there will be a strategic contestation. Uh, do you expect the US uh, to start leaning, for example, on countries like Pakistan to moderate their relationship with China, or to lower the strategic engagement that they have with China? Do you think if that was to happen, uh, they will be able to achieve anything? They haven't in the past, when China wasn't what it is now, and the US was much more than what it is now, at least perceptually. Uh, but do you think they will make a try once again? Uh, and what are the leverages that the US has, even if it was to attempt something like that? You're not giving the Pakistanis much aid, anyways. Uh, the trade is okay, it's important from a Pakistani perspective, uh, but maybe they can think of some workarounds if at all it comes down to that. But how do you think that triangular dynamic is going to play out if indeed it will be attempted from the US side?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I should say I don't expect the Trump administration to accord much priority to Pakistan at all, and that includes thinking about how to engage it in ways that could address U.S. interests when it comes to countering China. I mean, there's a pretty strong view in Washington, quite frankly, that I think is held on a bipartisan level, that despite what Pakistan says about wanting to balance its ties with both the U.S. and China, that it really is in China's camp, and it's easy to see why that's the case. I mean, it has a very special relationship with China, which it simply does not have with the United States. That said, yes, I think that to an extent we might see this administration try to apply a bit more pressure on Pakistan to reduce its reliance on China compared to what the Biden administration did. And that's because the administration might see an opportunity. And that opportunity is, despite, as you rightly noted, the Pakistan-China relationship is a strong one. It's actually been experiencing some significant bumps over the last year plus. China is increasingly worried about security threats to its investments and its people in Pakistan. And there was a very interesting article published by The Guardian the other day, which quoted a Chinese official in which he said, is, given how bad the security situation is, why would one want to invest in Pakistan? Something to that effect. That's pretty significant that you have a senior Chinese official. This is someone posted in Pakistan making those types of comments publicly. So there's a lot of concern in Beijing about the security of its investments in Pakistan. So one could argue that perhaps the Trump administration might see an opportunity, and what the U.S. might be able to do in terms of tools is using the tool that Nilanthi mentioned earlier, and that is the DFC. Now, the DFC, I would argue, was used increasingly frequently by the Biden administration as an appendage of its Indo-Pacific strategy. I mean, of course, the idea behind DFC is to sponsor infrastructure investments in the Indo-Pacific in order to counter China. And as Donald Lu said some months ago, the idea with this Indo-Pacific strategy is to provide a better alternative or a better proposition compared to what China is able to do with investments. So, given that the DFC has this great power competition angle to it, I would think that the Trump administration might want to pick up on that and try to bring the DFC, explore possibilities for bringing DFC into Pakistan. DFC currently does not have much of a portfolio at all in Pakistan. There's a few projects, but there's not much going on. Um, but there might be an opportunity, or the administration might think that there is an opportunity to look into. Now, the thing about the DFC is that over the course of the Biden administration, most of the investments that it was sponsoring focused on things like clean energy, clean energy technologies. I don't think that's the type of investments that the Trump administration would have much of an interest in pursuing. So if the administration were serious about trying to bring DFC into Pakistan, it would probably want to offer something different. Now, if the Trump administration were to try to approach Pakistan about bringing DFC into Pakistan, it would essentially be knocking on a wide open door. Pakistan badly wants its relationship with the US to have some type of substance to it, which quite frankly, it hasn't over the last few years. It's really been lacking an identity. It's been struggling to find areas of cooperation. The areas of cooperation that did emerge in US-Pakistan relations during the Biden era were the very types of issues that Trump won't really be interested in. The Green Alliance framework, climate change cooperation, clean energy issues, that's not going to be there. Development assistance has been a pretty big part of the US-Pakistan relationship. And as we all know, Trump has suspended all US foreign assistance for 90 days. So I think that the Pakistanis would be very happy if the Trump administration tried to think of ways to bring DFC in. If you look at what's happened over the last few years, officials from DFC have traveled to Pakistan to look into investment opportunities, but you didn't really have much there. But I'll conclude by going back to what I said at the start. Pakistan is not going to be a country that the Trump administration looks at as a key battlefield for great power competition. And I think that many in the administration will simply shrug off Pakistan and conclude that, well, it's got the special relationship with China. Despite the bumps in that relationship recently, why are we even thinking about bringing infrastructure investments to Pakistan, given that we already know where Pakistan stands? Back to you.
If I was a Pakistani and listening to you, I would be very, very happy that you're not going to be breathing down my neck. But just a small follow up on the issue of terrorism. How much do you think that issue will have salience with Trump 47? And not just terrorism, even things like, the normal stuff on censorship, on stuff like democracy, and of course women's rights in the connection of Afghanistan. Do you think those are issues that the Trump administration will be bothered about, or do you think they'll just shrug them off?
Yeah, I would argue that the Trump administration's foreign policy is, you can't get further away from this idea of a values-based foreign policy that the Biden administration early on in its term said that it was going to carry out. As we all know, it was applied extremely selectively. It was applied very heavily in Bangladesh. It wasn't applied nearly as vociferously in other countries where U.S. strategic interests called for that to be the case. In terms of terrorism, I alluded before to the ISK issue, and I do think that Pakistan will try to exploit what will clearly be a desire on the part of the second Trump administration to focus on curbing this ISK threat. We've heard Mike Waltz in a series of interviews really talk about how worried he is about terrorism risks emanating from Afghanistan, not just ISK but also Al Qaeda. And again, he essentially he thinks of the Taliban as a terrorist organization. He says that Afghanistan is a Taliban-led caliphate hosting Al Qaeda and ISK. So ISK is mainly based in Afghanistan. It has a presence in Pakistan. I think the Pakistanis are going to try to exploit that anxiety that you have in the administration. They tried to do this with the Biden administration. Once it became clear that the Biden administration was viewing the threat, the increasingly global threat projected by ISK as something to be concerned about. But honestly, we saw what Trump did during his first term, right? He cut almost all security assistance to Pakistan. He's never had anything positive to say about the Pakistani military, the establishment. And in that sense, I don't think his administration would be at all inclined to look into counterterrorism cooperation with Pakistan. You look at people like Rubio and Waltz and others. These are some of the harshest critics of Pakistan in Washington. Trump is right there as well. On the issue of the other issues that you mentioned, women's rights in Afghanistan, censorship, that type of thing. Yeah, I just don't think that you're going to see much of a focus on that. You brought up Imran Khan before. I could give a response to that in one line. Unless Trump thinks there's something in it for him, he'd have absolutely no reason to try to lobby on behalf of a foreign politician in jail far away from the U.S. So contrary to what many of Imran Khan's supporters think, aside from perhaps posting a few tweets or comments on social media, bringing attention to Khan's plight, I would be surprised if if Trump tried to make a pitch to pressure the Pakistani establishment to release Khan from jail.
A lot of hearts of Imran Khan supporters. But Nilanthi, so here is the question. You have a Trump administration which um, is looking at making a play with some of the big players and letting some of the smaller countries, which might otherwise have received some attention, partly for geographical reasons, partly for other reasons, uh, from previous administrations, they might not be getting that same kind of a consideration anymore. Do you think at one level this creates an opportunity for a country like China? Although given the Chinese developmental model, it's much worse than anything anybody else has to offer. But even so, uh, it creates an opportunity for China to step into a certain vacuum that could be left with the policies of the Trump administration. Uh, to cut a long story short, is the US still an indispensable nation for the smaller countries in the region and beyond? Or do you think that that is now a thing of the past? That countries will probably have their own agency, will try and, if the Americans ignore them beyond a point or lean on them beyond a point, they'll try and cut their own deals wherever they can get those deals, and learn to live without U.S. beneficence or whatever else you want to call it. How do you think that is likely to move forward?
It's an interesting question because I think we've seen this 90-day pause on foreign aid as Michael mentioned, but I think there are still many possibilities that could exist after this review, especially when you look at some of the major policy initiatives under the first Trump administration that they had an interest in then. They seem like obvious candidates for pursuing now under the second Trump administration. And I mean, I think, I mentioned with Maldives that was a significant effort on the part of the first Trump administration to open an embassy, to announce that a U.S. embassy will be open. And we've since seen two embassies set up in each other's capitals, the exchange of ambassadors on each side. So that's, I don't think that a smaller country would necessarily be ignored. We saw the opposite actually under the first Trump administration. So I think that presents the possibility that under this administration there may be other interesting priorities, like in Nepal, another smaller state, the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact that was actually signed under the first Trump administration, and there's an energy and electricity component to that. So I think that seems like an obvious candidate where this Trump administration, has an interest in seeing the success of that. But of course, this is all pending the review on all foreign aid. But I think we should be considering what have been achievements of the first Trump administration as potential achievements as well. I saw with the news reports about the government of Bangladesh. They were able to secure the first LNG supply deal under the new Trump administration, and it's been clear that energy is a priority for this administration. It was also mentioned in the first Trump administration's national security strategy, so I think that suggests some continuity as well. So I think the smaller South Asian countries, that they're not necessarily going to be ignored. Just right now there's a there's a temporary freeze, and there's new criteria that's been outlined by Secretary of State Rubio about how funding and of these programs will proceed and how they'll be assessed. But I don't think that they'll necessarily be ignored. And right, to your question about China, the thing about smaller states is that they're pretty open to most forms of engagement. They need as much assistance and capacity building as possible. So I think from their part, that they need as much support. And then as we are seeing how the new administration it's only been a week, so we're seeing how their priorities will unfold in the next few months, and perhaps we'll see another national security strategy document potentially by the end of this year, as we saw with the first Trump administration. They had released their NSS by December of their first year. So we'll see what the priorities will be, but I think to what extent that these countries are going to engage with other powers like China, if the U.S. chooses not to engage, yes, the smaller countries are going to engage on as many areas that will help them in terms of assistance and capacity building.
So, we didn't have a bad time with the Biden administration. There was a lot achieved between India and the United States under Biden administration. But of course, there were some points of friction. Most of them on the kind of sermonizing and moralizing that came from that particular administration, which of course was quite galling for anybody in India. And there were, of course, some areas of disagreement, including, for example, on Bangladesh, uh, on Myanmar, and a couple of other areas. How do you think those disagreements are going to be handled going forward? Because what's happening in Bangladesh is not exactly a good thing from an Indian perspective. Uh, it seems that we are increasingly having a very hostile Bangladeshi regime in place. Uh, it was at least backed by the Biden administration, but that administration is not there. Do you think there will be continuity as far as the Trump administration is concerned? And where does a country like Myanmar, which is in deep crisis, figure as far as this administration is concerned? Is there any scope for India to work together with the Trump administration on some of these regional hotspots to try and
Short answer is yes. Long answer is, in the Biden
give me the
administration,
complicated answer?
okay, my most fun, complicated fact about this is when we say that the Biden administration backed whatever is currently happening in Bangladesh, the State Department did. National Security Council, a lot of the times in my conversations with White House, NSC staffers, or generally people from the administration that are not career diplomats, that haven't benchwarmed in the State Department for at least 20, 30 years, they understood India's concerns. They understood the fact that the State Department in DC gets to have the benefit of distance. When they talk about Bangladesh, India doesn't have that advantage. For us, it's a security risk. It's not, we can't sermonize. And like the things that we heard in, oh, we told you so kind of tones were about we put our eggs in one basket. There was no other basket. Like, what are we talking about? There weren't any options. With that said, when we connect the two dots here, which is a 90-day stop on foreign aid, the biggest impact of that is going to be Bangladesh. They're going to feel it the most. Now, what does that mean? Exactly as Lanti said, countries of certain size that are going through crisis aren't particularly moralistically inclined towards who they take money from. They just need the money and they need it fast. If they have multiple options for the money, they pick the one with the fewer strings attached. Long-term strings, everyone will have strings. If the IMF is involved, they typically go there because they know they can get concessions about loan repayments, etc., which is what Sri Lanka did. But Bangladesh, if you stop aid immediately, and if India has a chance to talk to the American administration, where a lot of the senior State Department diplomats have been asked to resign, so it's going to be a lot of restaffing, and the historical thoughts and biases they had towards Bangladesh are now open to be reframed. India has a chance to talk to them about the fact that the three-pronged approach that your Secretary of State wants you to take, the strong, safe, prosperous America, that depends on a strong, safe, prosperous South Asia counterbalancing China. And with Bangladesh that takes money from China, defeats the purpose. So when you restart aid, how much of it are you willing to restart with? If you're not willing to foot the entire bill that the Biden administration was footing, how much of it can India now cash in with? How much can like-minded countries collectively do for Bangladesh? All of those questions are now in play. Bangladesh, I think, will be handled a little more, let's say, from an India lens than it was before. So that is it's a little better for India, but we can't say. Again, it's been 1 week. We don't know where the chips will fall. There is an opportunity. Myanmar as a whole, I don't see it being a priority at all for the Trump administration, strangely, which, well, not strangely at all, because they don't want to put money in just rehabbing refugees. As far as the crisis goes, I think they will be open to using aid channels to ensure that border crossings of refugees are limited. Beyond that, they don't care too much right now. Depends on how things play out. But if you extend that conversation, I feel like when you talk about sermonizing, the annual human rights report comes out regardless of who's in power. South Asia and the global South, we've sort of gotten used to the fact that every 4 years, America yo-yos. They'll do one thing for 4 years, they'll change mind 4 years later. Doesn't matter if it's another Republican 4 years later. We can't guarantee that. So every time something this dramatic happens, we sort of look to each other. That's when voice of the global South sort of comes together. That's how things like that are established. So this is a ripe opportunity for India to take its position as the leader of the subcontinent, which it already is. It's one of those things, right? India is the bully in the subcontinent because it's 75% of the subcontinent. But now they don't have another benefactor, so they might as well come to us.
Thanks. The floor is open. Please identify yourself. Please keep your questions small so that we can get a maximum number of them in. And please say who you are directing your question to.
And I'm from the ORF. My question is to Prema. Well, I do agree that the nations have already formulated the strategy to tackle the US as to what to bargain and not to bargain. My question specifically is towards Quad, because with the Trump administration, Quad is definitely going to gain prominence, and there are going to be pressures that are going to come onto India, especially who has been reticent and has been slightly more conservative as regards to its approach towards the Quad, or its participation in the Quad. Probably he's going to ask India to give more, either economically or militarily, itself towards the Quad, dedicate itself towards the Quad. So what do you think, in your way, India is going to tackle this, or what does India have to bargain or to get out of this situation, so that it remains in Quad and yet it follows the way line it's still following in the Quad?
Can I take 5-6 questions so the questions is being addressed to you? Yeah, in the back.
Hi, good evening now. My name is Aditya and I'm a lawyer based in Delhi. My question is directed to both Dr. Mishra and Mr. Sareen. The question is, what can India expect the Trump administration's reaction to the whole alleged assassination plot of a US citizen and a Khalistani terrorist in US will be? What would their reaction be? India also recently shared a report with the US Biden administration in the last few days. So my question is, do you think it's a chapter closed, or would the Republicans also be as sermonizing as the Bidens were? I'm asking some crystal ball gazing here, but that's the question. Thank you.
Yeah. There was somebody out here.
So when both the conflicts started, Mr. Biden was in power, and now
Mic, yeah, so that everybody can hear.
actually it's a bit far. So
Yeah.
when both the conflicts started, Mr. Biden was in power, and now as Mr. Trump has held the realms of power. So, sir, although his policy is directed, and he came into the slogan with that he'll end both the conflicts very soon, and its policy is also going on in the same process right now. So, sir, considering that China, Russia, and now America both have people with similar traits leading the country with similar expansionist policies, so, sir, after these things get resolved, sir, what will be the new conflict zones that can open up, and what is the main hope of the South Asia after that?
Hello, my name is Harsh Thakur. I'm from Hindu College. A couple of questions and one point to put across. The notion that Trump administration is transactional is very grossly misplaced, because this has to be understood that I2U2 Quad, these things came into the picture because of that very administration. So it has just different priority or sets of priorities in its approaches. The question is largely about Bangladesh, because with the USAID going off the mark for Yunus government, and then we are looking at the railway protests which happened today, do we see things closing up on Yunus? And provided that now the Pakistanis and Chinese are keeping their hands on his head to keep him alive, the question being in here is Yunus government, or can we say that the days of Yunus government are limited?
India's umbilical cord in defense, I'm a retired naval officer, is fairly tied to Russia. Our oil consumption in the last 8 years has been, or 6 years has been lucky with Russia. Our nuclear plants are dependent for the time being, the big ones, on Russia. In the next Trump administration, do you see Trump trying to disturb our relationship with Russia, or try to take advantage and ask us to wean themselves away? Because you are now removing restrictions on a lot of dual use technology of nuclear. You just did that last month. And what do you see basically in the next 2 or 3 years? Trump looking at the India Russia umbilical cord, oil, nuclear, and defense.
I think I'll take you in the next round. So, Michael, you can start answering, and then I'll come to the other panelists.
Yeah, thanks for the question about India and Russia. Well, clearly, Trump, his views of Russia are more restrained, more moderate, I guess, than those of Biden and his administration. So I think that the conventional wisdom that the Trump administration will pressure India much less than the Biden administration had is correct. I think that will be the case. Though I would argue that the Biden administration eventually came around to the very simple fact that India has this special relationship with Russia and isn't about to change that just because the U.S. thinks it's not a good thing. But so yeah, I don't anticipate that you're going to see significant levels of pressure from Trump. But I do think on the commercial front, I do think that Trump might well say to India, "Why are you not buying more oil from us?" I think there's a very good chance that he'll do that. And then on the security front, I mean, I would think, given the administration's, given it's going to look at any type of relationship it has with any country in the world from this lens of, well, how does this advance our interests? What's in it for us, and so on. The fact that the U.S. is sending increasing amounts of sensitive military equipment and technologies into an Indian defense sector that continues to have significant levels of Russian military equipment, that's something that might concern Trump and his administration. But as I understand it, what the Biden administration had been trying to do was to try to play a long game and try to make the case to the Indian side that over the longer term, Russia, for practical reasons, is not going to be able to be a reliable security partner because of economic costs of the war in Ukraine and so on. I don't think that you're going to see the Trump administration take that approach at all. So I think that concretely what we could see is Trump and his administration trying to make a bigger pitch for India to import more American oil. And it's interesting, if you look at the data, it wasn't too long ago, I mean, about 3 or 4 years ago, when India was the top destination for American oil. Now, obviously, that changed in a big way after the global oil economy was impacted in a big way after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But there is that precedent there. And I think as the administration is looking to continue to build on the recent trend of scaling up of cooperation with India, there might be a tendency to look at not clean energy cooperation, but cooperation on oil and so on. Let me just very quickly. There's a question about Bangladesh. I'll let others respond to it. But I'm actually in Bangladesh now, and I'll say this is what I've been telling people here. there's going to be a lot of continuity between Biden and Trump on broader policy in South Asia. The Indo-Pacific policy will be adapted and so on. But I would argue that the US-Bangladesh relationship is likely going to change more than any other relationship in the region. And the main reason for that is that I can't imagine that President Trump will be happy with how the Biden administration left the US relationship with Pakistan, which is essentially one that was very focused around the idea of the US providing a lot of support to Bangladesh's efforts to stabilize and restore democracy and reform and so on. I think that for President Trump, that would sound a lot like nation building, which he really has said many times that he has no interest in supporting.
I think I'll take two questions. One was on Khalistan. I think broadly, there are two things that I think work in favor of a perception that it might not be as intense as it was under Biden administration in terms of bilateral relationship, in terms of the reflections of the Khalistani issue on the bilateral relationship. One is that, if you look at the campaign, the presidential campaign, very little was said by the Republicans about this, almost zilch. So I think that's a positive that the Republicans were able to sort of keep a lid on it. The second is it has entered the Department of Justice way. So it has its own process. And given the tenuous relationship between Trump and DOJ itself, that carves a special picture of its own. So I think if you look at those dynamic, the Khalistan issue may change tenor, but it comes with a caveat. The second is your question about, the Trump is not transactional. To my perception is that when we say transactional, it doesn't mean that he misses the point in striking a deal. If you look at, he's very strategic in terms of what he wants. And one example of that is how currently his calls are unraveling. If you look at the leaders he has met, the leaders he's called, the IMEC, to my mind, is certainly on his agenda, the India, Middle East economic. And what the Republicans may do instead is add a different dimension and there's some words that Italy may be added to the Pariah Sport extension, and it will become a Trumpian sort of spin to it. But if you look at he's probably got a stabler Middle East than it was, so he's been very strategic with it. One of the first calls that he has made is to the leader of Saudi Arabia. So I think he's being very strategic in what he wants to do in the Middle East. And if he really goes ahead with that connectivity project from where he left in his last term, I think India should have a greater footprint in the region. Thank you.
I'll address the one question that I don't think anyone else addressed. Most were on the Quad. The premise of the question was, how will India pull its weight, meaning India is not pulling it so far. I don't agree with the premise because, well, there is something to be said about the fact that the four countries in the Quad, when India entered it, it was all positive for India, and it continues to be because the bilateral relationships within the Quad, India was the one that had the most to gain by developing each of those bilaterals. Now, when you say pull their weight, the Quad has like 26 working groups. They've got like a tentacle everywhere. It's like one of those American cottage industries. We will go in every pie we find type of situations. The current conversation is how do we limit and focus it further. Let's reverse this. Instead of India pulling its weight, let's see what India can ask for via the Quad now that we see how important it is to this administration, with the Quad foreign ministers meeting being the first one that Marco Rubio attended, with the fact that India will host the summit this year, with the fact that there's conversations about Prime Minister Modi, some reports about going in April, some about February. We know the impact, we know the importance Quad has for them, and we know the impact Quad has for us. So if it's about what India can take over, well, let's push for us being a part of AUKUS Pillar 2. Because why are we not in it if Tokyo has been considered for it for the last, a year and a half, so to speak? They've not been formalized. Emmanuel, the ambassador to Tokyo, has talked about it, and I think because he gave a public statement too soon, they had to halt it. But it seems to be on the table. If the question is about make India pull its weight, if that's how they phrase it, we'll be like, we are happy to pull our weight in patrolling the waters that are close to us, where we have ports, like waters close to the Andamans. But put us in AUKUS Pillar 2, help us co-develop hypersonics, underwater capabilities, the Victoria class SSNs that you're giving to Australia, give us some, we'll patrol this area for all of us and we will report to you. And the interoperability we have will work. We'll do more exercises deeper. Happy to do that. South China Sea, thoda dur hai. Let's start here. Is how I'd answer that. Is there anything left?
There was one from the young man.
Something
Is your
about all
question answered?
conflicts
Yeah.
being in Biden's term. Anything about that? Conflict zones in South Asia. Which ones?
There's so many.
Why? Yeah, like there's, man, you have to wait to see how things pan out. There's too many that could be counted as conflict zones. If you're talking about the active ones, India is the one that's facing the biggest. Where I think Rajnath Singh said last week or last month that disengagement is almost complete at the border. We rely on a lot of American intelligence. We were thankful for it when it was given to us when the skirmishes began. The biggest conflict zones that matter to India are on the border. We'll work with Americans on that. I don't think the Americans will take away help on that. Bangladesh, internal dynamics, can it count as conflict? How do you define a conflict? Myanmar, again, we've answered how that's going to go. If something new happens, we'll deal with it as it goes. I don't see South Asia being a priority unless something burns.
And in any case, the expansionism in this is not from the Americans or the Russians. Expansionism, if it comes, will come from the Chinese. And at least on India's borders, I think the deployments tell their own story. On the seas, I think Prerna has just listed out what all we are doing and what all we would be ready to do. So I suppose that kind of answers. So we'll just go in for the second round of questions and that will be the last. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hema Chakraborty, and I'm from Global Peace Foundation, India. My question is about this example that Ms. Prerna gave about the fact that if there is a vacuum that is being created where smaller countries are not being felt, they don't feel like they're being given enough attention by the United States, India can step in and ask the United States to actually reimagine certain countries as, say, beneficial to United States interest. To what extent can India do that independently without going to the United States? Like, how can India leverage this vacuum, say, completely independently, say, even without US consultation or involvement? We're talking about China leveraging this. So how can India leverage it to, say, counterbalance China independently as its own independent base for countering China?
My name is Karni Singh. I work with a large cement company. So my question is that, it's been a long journey from the times a few years ago, or maybe a decade ago, people used to talk in terms of too much interference and this thing of Americans and superpowers and great powers, etc. Suddenly people saying like there is too little interference or some regions are being ignored, etc. But coming to South Asia, is there at this point in time, does anybody in South Asia own South Asia as a region? Because it's one of the most or the least integrated region. And what is it that when great powers are looking at you closely, or actually the best time to integrate is when nobody's looking at you, when you are ignored, that's a time that you could possibly get together, integrate yourself minimally, if not optimally. How is it that South Asians always blame it on others and have never got their act together as one unit? Will that happen now?
I just want to know, how much we can expect from the Trump administration for the security and bilateral trade, the data and information, the very first, because how much we are getting in the trillions or the particular price we are paying for the American administration here. So how much we can expect from the Trump administration? Because I know that that philosophy of Trump, which is conscious mind in between an unconscious mind, the psychology for the which is like jumping from here to there and connecting all those the relationship and making all those transactional, the new ways. So this is just only my question.
My question is, what can be the expected reaction from the Trump administration if India continues or increases its trade with Iran and Russia through the
Whom are you asking this question?
To Mr. Vivek.
Vivek?
My question, shall I repeat the question?
No, have you heard it?
So
it's
how
fine.
with the reaction and with emphasis to NSTC?
Okay, so we've done with the questions. I think, Michael, there was one to you.
Thanks. I heard the question to me, but I'm not sure I fully understood it. Could you just very briefly repeat what you meant? It sounds like you're looking for an idea of what to expect from Trump on certain contexts, but I missed that. Could you just, thank you.
I just want to know how much we can expect from the Trump administration. It's about data and information, which is related to bilateral trade and security, because again, we are targeting all the straits all over the Indo-Pacific. We are talking about US administration. We are talking about the bilateral trade, the new policies where we need to bound Trump. So for the Indian favors, so the new policy we need to came out because he's also taking decision. The Indian administration is ready somehow. So we are also from the ground. We are thinking how we can do the sustainable development in India, and we can pursue the exercises what we need to do. So this is my question.
We've been having. I mean, there's been so much focus on Trump's tariff policies and how that could impact key partners, including India, and there's a good chance that it could be hit by that. But I actually would argue that there's an opportunity here, with this concern about the possibility of tariffs, that might create the incentive for some type of negotiation on towards some type of, not FTA, but some type of economic partnership accord. And I certainly have heard some statements from the Indian side that suggest that there's interest in discussing those issues. But I think that's the best I could say if I understood your question. Just very briefly, I think that someone had asked a question earlier about the issue of Gautam Adani and his indictment and how Trump might handle that. I would actually argue, and this might be contrary to what some might hope there in India. I don't think that I think that Trump would actually be very keen to leverage that indictment. I don't think he would think that he should essentially take pity on Adani and sympathize with him as a fellow successful businessman who's been very supportive of Trump and so on. I think that for Trump, there might be an opportunity to leverage that indictment in ways that could work toward outcomes that benefit U.S. interest, including looking to steer India in a certain direction on the tariff front. So that's what I would say about that.
Quickly on Iran and Russia, I think the relationship with Iran, it was under American pressure that India brought its imports to zero from Iran. And I think, but we've reached again with Iran a balancing position where we can say to the United States, where in terms of management of the Chabahar port, etc., where I think it's a ground where you can push back against the US and say that we've done when we've brought the oil imports down when you need it. But I think on other issues, I think the Americans shouldn't have a problem. Besides, I think in the Chabahar, there's so much of sanctions still on the steel bit that there's hardly much lifting off the ground. On Russia, I think my sense is that there could be, if the Trumpian plan of drill baby drill really unravels to the extent that he imagines, then I think more supply lines are in order, and Trump would necessarily pressure most countries, and India as one of the top importers is definitely in the crosshairs then. How India negotiates is a different question, and I think where some of those and what deal can you reach with Trump on that is something that we'll have to wait and see. But I think on Russia we could face pressures. I could take the South Asian integration question, but I'll leave that to you. Interestingly, I mean, broadly, if you look at South Asia historically, we are countries of this region have historically said to the great powers, stay out of this region. So I think, and then we happily after that remain unintegrated. And I think that's the tenet of our character. Plus, there's conflict. There's a question that when can the next conflict really pop up? If that's the psyche, that historical psyche of this region, then I think we are more prone to remaining unintegrated than integrated. But I think countries of this region largely resist integrate.
Maybe we should be very careful what we wish for in terms of integration. But
Kinder on the South Asia element and say we typically reject interventionism, but our rejection doesn't mean that we have been able to prevent interventionism. Great powers still put their feet wherever they want to, which has led to a myriad of problems. And then again, to be kinder, South Asia, the entire region is very young. Like the states haven't existed for a long time. The biggest power being us. The economy is growing enough now that we've of late started increasing very actively, very methodically increasing our development aid, the vaccines that we provide, HADR exercises through the Quad, where India has really built up a credibility with smaller states. To your question about can India fill the vacuum on its own, India will fill the vacuum on its own wherever it's a national security imperative. Again, but like, can it completely fill the vacuum? Does India have that kind of money or intent? We'll put a band-aid on a bullet hole till we see other options. If we see other partners coming in, great. If we don't see other partners coming in, we'll keep band-aiding it. It's an evolving situation. You can't imagine that I will, I don't know, buy it off of money and then everything will be hunky-dory. Though we don't have that kind of money. And secondly, that's not how conflicts work. Simultaneously, do we see the Americans getting interested in this region again? Sure, they will. The question is about how do you use every opportunity brought to you to build credibility? HADR, again, as an example. If DFC, certain contracts of DFC that weren't taken away in the 90-day ban, like that money for which was already dispersed, which is the $70 million or so to develop vaccines with Indian companies. Clean energy, sure, that will be impacted. We are on target for our net zero goals anyway because we created a realistic target. It wasn't mid-century, it was 2070. We'll deal with that when DFC restarts giving money. We'll deal with that 4 years later. We'll deal with that through subnational cooperation with the Americans. There are enough avenues to get aid, to get money, to make deals happen, even when the federal government of the United States stops. C40, the mayor's organization, started in Trump term 1 precisely because of this. It's still going on. It's a very big organization now. I think the London mayor does more for that than any other American mayor, actually. So we can put our eyes there. We'll be fine, guys. It's okay. South Asia doesn't have to shrink and shrivel away because of 1 week into the new administration. Like, chill.
I think that last sentence is probably sums up the entire session today. Thank you very much, Nilanthi, Michael, Vivek, and Prerna. And thank you everybody who's attended this session. And a lot of thanks are due to my colleague Shivam, who's put this whole thing together, Komal, who set up all the communications. Thank you, everybody. I hope to see you next month for another session of this. Thanks a lot.